All right, afternoon, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce one of the leaders in research in carbon capture, sequestration, and storage in the United States, Dr. Sallie Greenberg. Sallie is the principal scientist of energy and minerals at the Illinois State Geological Survey, where she leads a team of scientists engaged in CCUS projects. She's got more than 20 plus years of experience in environmental geology with a focus on understanding the societal impacts of natural resource utilization and climate change issues. We've known Sallie for a long time and been very happy to have both known her and work with her. I look forward to do so in the future. As a side note of interest, Sallie was trained as an isotope geochemist and rarely uses it, which is what happened to both Scott and myself back in the day. So we have a lot more in common than just CCUS, and we're happy to have it. Thanks, Sallie.
So the question is, can you hear me over your chip eating, or do I need the microphone? You good? All right. If you start to not be able to hear me, which has never ever been a problem for anybody, tell me and I'll use the microphone, but I'd rather not sort of double fist the presentation if I don't have to. So I'm very happy to be here. I was telling Scott just a little while ago that I seem to spend an inordinate amount of time in Wyoming, which is kind of fabulous, but I find myself like I've been on only a couple of business trips this year. They've both been to Wyoming, one to Jackson Hole, one to here. I've been in this building many, many times. I gave a presentation here back when Dave Moorbacher was the head of EORI. And so it's always fun for me to be in Wyoming. I am going to try to give you a high level path through carbon capture, utilization, and storage today, kind of from the perspective of what is happening right now and where do I see us going in the future. And then I'm going to occasionally dip into some of the work that we've done in Illinois for the past 20 years and some of the things that I think are interesting and complicated about the world of CCUS, which don't necessarily have to do with technology, geology, or engineering. So hopefully you will enjoy the ride. As Scott said, I am at the University of Illinois, at the Illinois State Geological Survey. I'm destroying equipment. And I have been there for almost 30 years. The last 20 of which have been in the carbon capture, utilization, and storage space. But as you will see during the course of this presentation, I also dip into many, many other areas. So where I'd like to start is by saying that carbon capture, utilization, and storage is a puzzle that many of us, some of us in this room and many of us around the country and around the globe have been working on for more than 20 years. And we approached it from several different perspectives, from the technical perspective, from the social perspective, what are the legal and regulatory systems we need to have in place, and what are the policy and economic needs and drivers that need to be in place. And I'm happy to say that really in the last 20 years, those pieces have started to come together. They used to be really, really far apart. Now they're much closer together. And one of the ways that I can tell that that's the case is if you look at the way that we talk about carbon capture and storage has changed since I started in the late 90s. So we used to talk about technical and non-technical barriers. Then we had more experience, had more research opportunities. Then we started to talk about what are the obstacles. And then as we got closer to injection of CO2, what are the challenges that we overcame to get there? And then in about 2015, we started to talk more about what are our successes and what are our examples. And then I would say for the last 4 years or so, we've really started to focus on, okay, now we know that we can do carbon capture and storage. What do we need to do to expand it to meet our objectives for the technology? But like anything you ask a scientist, their answer is always going to be, well, it's complicated. So it's complicated. And you can see from this figure that it's not just about the technology, but it's about economics, it's about people, it's about the environment, it's about keeping the lights on, it's about justice, it's about power structure, it's about what is happening in the subsurface, what's happening globally, what's happening legally, all of those things. And I showed you in my previous slide, which was somewhat simplistic and perhaps a little misleading, that the pieces are coming together. But the more you get into this space, the more you realize there are more pieces and there's more refinement that's needed every step of the way. And that's the space that we find ourselves in right now in the world of CCUS. So we hear a lot of talk right now about the energy transition and what that's going to mean. And let me preface this whole presentation with, we can come at this problem or this conversation from a variety of perspectives. We can come at it from a scientific perspective. We can come at it from a political, perhaps diverse political views. What I'm trying to do is present sort of the state of play of where we're at right now, without necessarily taking a stance on where we're at. What I think is interesting about this slide from IHS Markit is that carbon management and climate is right in the middle of this figure, looking at what are we going to do about conventional energy and power combined with renewable energy, looking at technologies, and then automotive changes. So this whole suite is what people are thinking about when they talk about the energy transition. But again, it's complicated. And just because we are focused potentially on decarbonization as a driver for an energy transition doesn't mean that we're going to get there overnight. Oops. But what we are seeing, and I realize now after talking with Scott this morning that this figure is wrong, because Wyoming should be on here as well, that we're seeing that many, many states have adopted or are adopting greenhouse gas emission targets. There are at least 24 and the District of Columbia that have targets that vary by baseline and by baseline year and what the target is. But increasingly, we're starting to see net zero by 2050. And we're starting to see that as well from corporations in the electricity sector, in the oil and gas market, even with the airlines. So there's a lot of focus around this. How do we get to net zero by 2050 with respect to CO2 emissions? Some work that has recently come out of Princeton, where they did analysis of what it takes to get to net zero by 2050. They looked at 5 different scenarios of an energy mix and what it would take to decarbonize the energy sector. So they look at 6 different pillars, which you can read for yourself. The one I want you to focus on, though, is that carbon capture utilization, or they say or storage, is one of these 6 pillars that they deem essential to the scenarios that they're examining. All of the pathways that they looked at, all 5 of the scenarios they looked at, rely on carbon capture utilization and storage in a range of either 0.7 to 1 gigatons per year of carbon stored between now and 2050 stored in geologic formations. So every model, every scenario that you're looking at in terms of the possibility of an energy transition relies on our ability to deploy this technology. Looking at what that means from a scale-up perspective, this is a slide that I took from John Watinsky at the U.S. Department of Energy's Fossil Energy and Carbon Management storage, he's showing here that where we're at in 2020 is that we have a significant amount of research and development projects. We're moving towards commercialization. And as we go forward, we are looking at the need for, by 2025, 5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year stored per project, up to, in 2040, an annual storage of 450 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. So significant scale up between now in the next 20 years. As I said before, the theme of this talk might as well be it's complicated. So just taking a look at infrastructure of how you might go about doing it. This map, in the upper map shows the existing CO2 pipeline network in the United States. There's 80 million tons of carbon dioxide moved per year through about 8,500 kilometers of CO2 pipeline. To get to where you need to be able to move and store CO2 by 2050, you're talking about needing 21,000 kilometers of pipeline, trunk line pipeline, with an additional 85,000 kilometers of spur line. So just look at the network of this compared to that in terms of some of the infrastructure you need to be able to do this. And so you might ask the question of, okay, so how does that actually happen? How do we get from where we are today to where we aspire to be by 2050? There's been a lot of activity in Washington. I'm sure many of you are hearing it on the news. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has been passed. It's expected to be signed maybe this week, maybe I've been traveling, so maybe the president already signed it and I missed it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, because in that act, there is a significant amount of funding that helps move us towards those 2050 goals with respect to carbon storage. So the Build Back Better Act also has significant components related to climate and environmental justice and a lot of other things, which also speak to our ability to move forward with this. But we also are in a situation where there's a continuing resolution for federal funding, which is due to expire in less than a month. So whether or not the federal government is operating on December 4th, we'll see. And then there's a lot of discussion about the federal debt limit, which is tied directly to the fact that you're talking about $1 trillion investment infrastructure bills. And so all of that mix is the soup in which we are swimming in with respect to carbon capture and storage. Just a little bit about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's about $12 billion for carbon capture, utilization, and storage over the next 5 years. And there's a significant amount for demonstration projects, for CCUS pilot projects, for storage, validation, and testing. There's money in here for Class 6 permitting, which is actually, much of this money goes to the Department of Energy, but the permitting money actually goes to the EPA and to states that have primacy. So that's designed to support the permitting process that needs to be in place for carbon storage. And then looking at direct air capture, carbon storage hubs. So we're going to see increases in the federal loan guarantee program. All of that stuff is driving towards increasing our ability to move up that arrow on that DOE slide. In place as of right now are several programs that the Department of Energy has had in place for many, many years, which is why people like Scott and Fred and Holly and I have known each other all these years. Right now, I'm sure many of you are aware of this, the Carbon Safe program, and I'm not going to read the acronym because it's a typical DOE acronym, but you have a project here. You've had a couple projects here in Wyoming. You have one that's active in association with Dry Forks. We have a couple in Illinois, and what is happening is that these are projects designed to look at characterizing a geologic storage complex that can hold 50 million tons of carbon dioxide over a period of 30 years. One of the things that I heard from the Department of Energy on Tuesday was that they are now looking at accelerating that to be 50 million tons of carbon dioxide stored over 10 years. So same projects, shorter duration of time, and ultimately more projects. What's also happening is that many of these projects are combined with capture studies. So it's not just about storage, but it's also about demonstrating carbon capture, primarily using amines at scale, at commercial scale. And so making sure that that technology is keeping pace with our ability to do carbon storage. Also in place are what are called the regional carbon sequestration partnerships or the regional carbon sequestration initiatives. And these have been in place since 2003. The old map had 7 of those partnerships. And then a couple of years ago, through a different thinking at DOE, we combined them and turned it into 4. So many of you may know about the PCOR initiative, which is based out of the EERC at the University of North Dakota. And my partnership, so I used to lead the littlest partnership, which was called the Midwest Geological Sequestration Consortium, which then combined with Patel to create a partnership that focuses on the middle, what in my part of the world is called the Midwest. Depending on where you live in this country, what you call the Midwest changes. And so from roughly in Mississippi over to the Atlantic Ocean, and then so the Midwest and the Northeast. There's not a lot of geologic storage potential, in the north. Sorry, pushing buttons like a crazy one. In the Northeast. So much of our focus is really in the Illinois Basin, the Appalachian Basin, Michigan Basin, are areas where we're looking about carbon storage in my part of the world. I don't want to presume that you know what carbon capture, utilization, and storage is. I also don't want to insult your intelligence. So I'm going to take a couple of slides to just run through the basic concept of what I'm talking about when I say carbon capture and storage, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, carbon capture and utilization or storage, carbon management. All of that in my head is the same thing, and comes out somewhat differently, where you have a point source of carbon dioxide, which you capture either through chemical or physical means, and then you decide if you're going to use it, which is utilization, and then that's a pathway that you take where you convert it into something useful, like you're doing here at the University of Wyoming. I had a really interesting conversation with Richard this morning. Or you decide you're going to store it, and that leads you to geologic storage. Another pathway, which is certainly important here in Wyoming, is using it for enhanced oil recovery. Not a popular subject right now, but not a subject that's really going to go away anytime in the near future. So primarily, if CO2 is used, it is used for enhanced oil recovery. But we're focused on, at least in Illinois, we're focused on geologic storage in what is called a saline formation. So in other words, has never held hydrocarbons that are desirable to be produced. One thing I want to point out is sometimes figures like this are a little bit misleading. So geologic storage looks like it's kind of a short distance from the surface to the subsurface, which is categorically not true. And this gives you a much better perspective of where you've got carbon capture and transportation happening on the surface and carbon storage happening thousands of feet beneath the surface. So the work that I did, I led in Illinois, we were injecting carbon dioxide at about 6,800 feet beneath the surface. So that's much more typical than the previous diagram, which looked like, you know, maybe it was a couple hundred feet under beneath the subsurface. And which is, yeah, just not how it works. So there's a few key geologic concepts that we care about as geologists who are focused on storage. And those geologic concepts are porosity, permeability. And so porosity is how many holes are in a rock formation. So if you think about a sandstone, or at the macroscopic level, a crate of oranges, where you have spheres that touch each other, there's a lot of open space. That space is called pore space. And in the subsurface, it's filled with oil, water, brine, or natural gas, unless you're above the water line. And so Swiss cheese has high porosity, but it doesn't have high permeability. And permeability is the connectedness of those spaces. So can something move through it? Is it permeable? So those factors are super important. And you also want to know whether or not your rocks have the ability to trap. So is there a structural trap? Is there a way that you can trap stored carbon dioxide in your porous space? So you're looking at injectivity. Can I inject something, in this case carbon dioxide, into the subsurface? Capacity, how much can it hold? Containment, am I sure that it's going to stay in place? And then production, in some cases, from an oil and gas perspective, can I take something out of the subsurface? And really, what we're doing with geologic storage is we're doing the opposite of production. We're looking for a place that has trapped something in the subsurface for hundreds of millions of years, so that we can put something there, return carbon that has been extracted and stored, and we can store it permanently in the subsurface. So this is what I was talking about before. You can see here typical sandstone from the Illinois Basin of the Mount Simon. All of these blue spaces are pore space. And then this is a scanning electron microscope that shows you close up what those pore spaces look like. This is the actual rock that we're injecting into in Decatur, Illinois, where my project is. And then what sits above that is what's called a seal. And that is an impermeable rock, typically made from clays or the muck at the bottom of a pond, which gets turned into a seal. So you basically have a rock formation that is a target or a sink with a seal above it. And that's important because carbon dioxide is a compressible gas. So you can make it into a liquid, or you can make it into a liquid with gas-like properties, but it's less dense than water or brine. So when you inject it, you want to make sure that it's not going up. You want to make sure that it stays trapped in the subsurface. And that's why you need to have that package of rocks. So where can you do it? This is a good look at the basins in and around North America. This is from the Clean Air Task Force. This is an interactive website you can go to. All of these gray areas are basins, sedimentary basins, where we potentially can store carbon dioxide. Just the color coding, these large dots are CO2 sources, and the legend here gives you an indication of what those sectors are that they come from, and also the size of the dot implies how much emissions are coming from those. One of the things that you'll notice is that the places where there's colored dots don't necessarily match up in the places where there are sedimentary basins where your storage potential is happening. So there's the potential need for transportation and the movement of CO2 from what we would call a source to a sink. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the stuff that I've been involved in Illinois. And Much of what I'm about to say about Illinois applies to Wyoming. So you can change Illinois to Wyoming in your head if you want to. I won't hold it against you. But people ask me sometimes, you know, like, why would you want to do this here? And the answer is, completely as an unbiased geologist, we have exceptional geology for this in the Illinois Basin. We have 6 sandstones that are at the base of our sedimentary section, very thick, no hydrocarbons, very few well penetrations into those reservoirs, which is great if you want to store something, but not so great if you need information about what is going on in the subsurface. So not a lot of data, but a lot of great storage potential. We also have continuous seals, primary, secondary, and tertiary seals that protect the reservoir from the upward migration of CO2. And we have a lot of rural land surface where you have good access to pore space. And we happen to have a lot of sources of CO2. We are globally recognized leaders in the research in this space, as is Wyoming. We have seen over the years that there are federal and state policy drivers that are moving carbon capture and storage forward. There are incentives in place now related to tax credits and other policies. Don't read this list because it's literally changing every day, and it's not sure. I'm not sure where it's going to end up, but it's definitely changing. And then there's significant potential for infrastructure development, job creation, and economic investment associated with carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So what we have done in Illinois is that we've been on a progression since about 1999 through first the regional carbon sequestration partnerships, and then some of what some of you might remember from a gazillion years ago, the future gen related projects, and then more recently into the carbon safe space. There's also, at this end of the arrow, there's a lot of commercial interest that is happening. We have commercial projects that are being developed. Some of you maybe have heard about this Navigator pipeline project. Their ADM recently announced something with 8 Rivers, looking at using their infrastructure indicator to store CO2 produced from an 8 Rivers power plant. So there's a lot of, it's a hotbed of excitement in the Illinois Basin. And if you've ever been to Illinois, I hope you would laugh at that because it's not an exciting place. It's a great place to live, but it's, and so, you know, what we've done is we've progressed from 1 million tons of carbon dioxide stored over a period of 3 years to 1 million tons per year to broader characterization to ultimately this carbon safe that could take, you know, 1 million to 5 million tons of CO2 per year from 2 different sources. And what you've seen is a progression of the last 20 years, but what that allows us to do is build on what we've done, and so step ourselves up that progression. The same thing has been happening here in Wyoming. And so, and you know, science and engineering can happen at a relatively fast pace, but this stuff is not a toaster. It's not like you can just go out and buy one and plug it in and it works. You have to vet and demonstrate and prove the concept. And so some people would say we haven't been doing anything for the last 20 years. And I would argue we've actually been doing quite a lot. And the United States has been doing a lot more than a lot of other places in this space and has really gotten to that place where we're talking about success and viable potential to deploy CCUS. So the other thing that I think is really interesting about the work that we've done is what I have here at the top, it's a little hard to read, is what our workflow is, where we go from screening to pre-feasibility to feasibility and permitting. This is the carbon safe phase 3 space, to executing and constructing a project and then operating it for 20, 30 years, to what happens when you stop injecting and then you have post-injection monitoring requirements. So we have projects in Illinois that have done the full scale of all of these. So the project I led, the Illinois Basin Decatur project, which ended earlier this year, did it all. We went from screening to deployment to getting the first Class 6 permit in the United States to a fully operational plant that, or a project that injected for 3 years, and then concluded its post-injection monitoring. There's a second project in Decatur, which built on this project, used all the data and information and models that we had available. And they started basically, because we had already done the pre-feasibility work for them, at the ability to start with permitting and go straight into the construction and operation phase. And that project is still injecting CO2 on a daily basis. What we see with our carbon safes is that they designed the program a little different. So you go from screening in a phase 1 to pre-feasibility in a phase 2 to our phase 3 that I'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute, where the deliverable is a Class 6 permit, which is what your DEQ folks in Wyoming are going to see here pretty soon. And then ultimately, and we got the word on this on Tuesday as well, the program, the way the Department of Energy has designed it is that there was potentially a phase 4, which is build, execute, and operate. And so until the infrastructure bill came along, there wasn't a line of sight on where that funding was going to come from. But now we think that we're going to see the funding for phase 4 for these projects come out of that bill. What you typically have is that you are starting to narrow down here. This is a financial investment decision, whether or not you're going to invest. You also have capture. And when those two things meet, then you're going to go into an operational phase, which is what's happening with our carbon safe project. So a little bit of project details. This is the an aerial view of the work in Decatur. So the project at the bottom is the Illinois Basin Decatur project. The project at the top is the Illinois Industrial Sources project. There's about a mile between CCS1 and CCS2, which are the injection wells for those projects. And then the VW wells are deep monitoring wells drilled to the same depth as the injection well. And the GM wells are dedicated geophysical wells that have geophones strapped to tubing so that we tried to do walkaway VSPs, vertical seismic profiles, which didn't work very well. But we have the ability, we have permanent passive seismic sensors in place. You can also see kind of at the bottom, there's a small box and then a bigger box. One is blue, one is purple. I apologize if you're colorblind. The small box is purple, or they're both kind of blue and purple, whatever. And then those have pipelines that go to the various wellheads. They hold the first 2 Class 6 permits in the United States. And here's some demographics, and I won't necessarily read them. I've already said some of this. The major differences between these 2 projects is that the Illinois Basin Decatur project was really a research demonstration project designed to learn as much as we possibly could about the process of capturing and storing carbon dioxide from ethanol. So we captured CO2 from an ethanol production plant in Decatur, Illinois. So that's essentially 99.9% pure CO2 that only needs to be dehydrated and compressed before you can inject that. So easy to capture, easy to compress, and to deliver via pipeline. So the big difference is how much was stored and the period of time in which they operated and the rate at which the CO2 was being injected. So the Illinois Basin Decatur project injected CO2 from November of 2011 to November of 2014. And the Industrial Sources project, which is still operating, began injection in April of 2017. There's a whole backstory about permitting, which I'm not going to cover in this presentation, but the whole reason for those timescales is related to permitting. As of June, so this number is a tiny bit out of date, which I apologize for. We're probably looking at about 3.6 million tons of carbon dioxide stored collectively between these two projects. So what we've done is demonstrated the technology through these two projects and then are using that for other, as a basis for other projects. Some of the folks, SCR folks that I was talking to a little bit ago, this gives you an idea of the density of the monitoring system that we have in place, which is greater for the Illinois Basin Decatur project than it is for the Industrial Sources project. So by downscaling the environmental monitoring and understanding what gives you the most information for your amount of research effort, we were able to streamline the monitoring program so that it meets the regulatory objectives, but also allows you to operate at reasonable cost for longer periods of time. So we developed a first of a kind monitoring, verification, and accounting program. We met and exceeded all the technical and non-technical challenges. Anybody who knows me knows that I hate that phrase. Successful Class 6 permitting, microseismic, so induced microseismic activity is one of the major outcomes of the work at the Illinois Basin Decatur project, which has allowed us to understand in much greater detail the impact, the potential for unfelt, so magnitudes of -1 to 1 seismic activity in the subsurface, and how to mitigate that. So one of the things that is really interesting is between those two projects, the CCS1 well and the CCS2 well. So the first project, we had a significant amount of microseismic activity. We were injecting at about 6,800 feet beneath the surface. We, as a result of some of our analysis, decided to perforate the second well 150 feet higher, only 150 feet higher. So like call it 6,700 feet from the surface. And basically there is little to no microseismic activity happening at the site at this time, even though you have higher injection rates and more CO2 being injected at that time. So a lot learned about how you can mitigate the potential for induced seismicity in the subsurface. So that's one of the things that we're most proud of is our understanding of that. Look, it's laid the foundation for a lot of projects, multiple national and international collaborations. We've been talking this morning about how Wyoming and Illinois can do more things together. And then a lot of stakeholder engagement, trusted relationships, and very important and comprehensive data sets. So I like this slide. This picture was taken the very first day we started to drill the injection well. And it was February. So it doesn't look as cold as it was, but it's a good picture. So we're looking at over 3 million tons of CO2 stored from 2 biofuels project, more than 5,000 meters of wells drilled, 245 meters of core, more than at this point, I would say that's probably more than 80,000 groundwater samples analyzed. We've used more than 1 million CPU hours on supercomputers at the University of Illinois for our modeling. We've had thousands of visitors from multiple countries. Many of those people include people here. And then, more than 100 people from many organizations have worked on this project. So it really has been an incredible effort. Where we're at now with the Illinois Storage Corridor, which is our phase 3 project, which is similar to the Wyoming Dry Fork project, is that we are looking at a storage corridor with 2 sources. One is One Earth Energy, which is an ethanol plant, and the second is Prairie State Generating Company, which is one of the last coal-fired power plants to be built in the United States. And it is a mine mouth to production power plant. And so this looks at incorporating these two different sites and starts to get at this hub concept of looking at where you have a corridor of storage potential and where your sources are. This is very similar to what we were talking about this morning with respect to what is possible here in Wyoming. And this just looks at what the storage potential is and what rock, and we're looking at the Mount Simon, although we are also looking at other less traditional or less known reservoirs for additional storage capacity in the Potosi and the St. Peter sandstone, depending on where we're located, which one of the sources is located. So I'm going to move on from geology here. I see that I want to make sure I leave time for questions. I'm being cognizant of the time. Some of the things that we learn, especially about carbon storage, geology is always going to be a critical factor. That is going to drive carbon capture and storage no matter what happens, because the subsurface is not the same everywhere. And we have to do a good job of understanding what the subsurface potential is. Otherwise, you can capture all the CO2 you want at the surface. If you don't have something to do with it, then that doesn't really help us meet our goals and objectives. Baseline environmental assessments are critical. Some folks would tell you they're not, but you have to understand the environment in which you're storing CO2, because you're going to store CO2 in an environment that's full of CO2. So how do you know that your CO2 is different than the CO2 that was there when you started? Simplicity is important, and pilot and demonstration projects. Some people would say we should skip those and go straight to commercial, but I say that they have value. And the other thing is that science and engineering don't necessarily follow policy timeframes. So we've been fortunate in the last 20 years that somehow CCUS has stayed regardless of what type of administration you have. Sometimes how you talk about it changes, but we've had the ability to continue to do this work because it's important, whether it's for national security or it's for climate objectives, or it's for a lot of other reasons with respect to utilization or economic development. And so, but science and engineering don't follow the same pathways. And lastly, which leads me to some of my later slides, the regulatory, legal, and social factors cannot be underestimated as components of how you move forward in the CCUS space. So with that, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about, what are the challenges that we really face going forward? This is a graphic done by a graphic facilitator who's a friend of mine, Sunshine Van Bellenkasem, and she was facilitating a meeting where people were talking about how do we even do this? Like, how do we even begin to do this when you have so many diverse opinions? And so focusing on the fact that we all have good intentions, we all care about our children, we all care about our grandchildren's future, and we want to live in a nice place and have iPhones, right? So some people would argue with that last point, that just about everybody has a phone, right? So, there's a balance, and recognizing that, that there are common goals is probably one of the first places we need to start. And so, this goes back to that slide I showed in the beginning. We have to continue to bring those complicated pieces together and refine our understanding and our ability to work in a space to make this happen, to meet goals and objectives, which is increasingly difficult in a country that is increasingly focused in different directions. So one of the things that I find pretty interesting is this is a woman who Tricia Schuler. She used to be with the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, and she has a newsletter that she sends out, I don't know, monthly, every couple of weeks, something like that, where she talks a lot about holding multiple ideas in our head. And so one of the ways in thinking about changing the conversation and changing our approach to how we go forward is that we have to admit that there are conflicting ideas that exist in the same place and really are both true. For example, the world requires oil and gas. The dominant view of the public is that fossil fuels are gone. We don't need them. We can 100% move on without them, and that we have all of the means necessary to do so. And I find this super interesting. So because energy is so available and reliable, it has become figuratively invisible, making it such that we have to lay a groundwork for the public to understand that we still require it because we don't even see it anymore. And so just this whole paradox that we sort of exist in is an important space for us to recognize when it comes to solution-based thinking about how to deploy carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There's also what some people like to talk about is the social license to operate, which is an informal agreement that infers that you have ongoing acceptance of an industry and or energy project with a local community to do what it is that you're trying to do. And it's come to mean that the ongoing acceptance or approval is implicit. And it's a very difficult thing to gain. And it's stepwise, you know, it involves legitimacy, credibility, and trust. And you can lose any one of those things at any time. And so there are no guarantees of how that operates. And so you have to continually mind that space when you are thinking about what it takes from a social perspective to do these types of what some would say necessary energy related balanced projects, because not everybody sees them that way. Environmental justice. This has become sort of the buzzword of the current Biden administration. And we've seen executive orders in place that talk about Justice 40, where they're thinking about 40% of the overall benefits of federal investments in climate and clean energy go to disadvantaged communities. So how does investment happen? Who benefits from the deployment of carbon capture and storage? So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in this space is, if you remember back to the slide I showed you that sort of shows the value chain of capture, use, storage, and onward, the communities that are along that value chain are not going to be the same. So the capture community might benefit from the capture and removal of removal of CO2 from the air in their region. But the storage community may feel a burden that is associated with them taking on the responsibility or the risk of stored CO2. So this is really complicated if your measure is from an environmental justice perspective. And it's something that is increasingly needs to be filtered into that social license to operate and stakeholder engagement space. In addition, you have investment drivers and the expectation that you're going to have environmental social governance that is responsible, that corporations with shareholders are being held responsible to ensure that they uphold these values. And I just have a couple more slides, and this is a little bit for the students in the room, which I think there are a few, or those of you in the room who interact with students. And what I see happening in this space is that we need a broadening and a deepening of our approach to knowledge and what we do with that knowledge. So we can't really operate in these silos any longer, but we have to be able to think across all of the things that we've been talking about, or I've been talking about for the last 50 minutes, because you never know when the technology combined with the policy, combined with the environmental justice is going to be the place in which you have to operate. And so in order to solve these complex societal problems that we face with respect to things like, 1.5 or 2 degrees C climate objectives, you as technical people or non-technical people have to be able to operate in somebody else's space. So how does this relate to you and to your career? As far as I'm concerned, I think the sky is the limit. I should have had a picture of Wyoming in there, but it's not. And I think that that in order to prepare yourself for a future in the energy space, that you need to accept the challenges to do hard things and don't just do the things that you're good at. If you're good at science, don't just do science. Figure out how the stakeholder stuff works, or figure out how to talk to people about the work that you do. Consider your unique combination of skills. So this, I think, is something that is increasingly important, to be able to have multiple areas that you bring together in your life, and that's what makes you attractive to employers. So what are your experiences? What types of internships have you done? What have you done that's outside the box of a traditional path? You need to be able to embrace things that make you uncomfortable. Easy for me to say standing up here. Communicate your discipline. I think use media and other mechanisms to be influencers. You have to learn to tell good stories. You have to be able to communicate. You need to understand, as I said before, more than just your piece. And then this is critical. You have to be able to engage with people who do not share the same opinion as you. And that is increasingly difficult to do in this country. I had dinner with some friends of mine last night, and I am sure they were like, oh my God, this woman is off the rails. And it was so interesting, and whereas I think 20 years ago when we were in graduate school together, this woman and I, we probably were on the same path with respect to what our political perspectives were. And last night it was very clear that that was not the case. But you have to be able to sit in that environment and have those conversations. Otherwise, we're going to go nowhere. And so I encourage you to do that. And then increasingly, diversity, equity, access, and inclusion is important. So with that, I just have 10 minutes for questions. Happy to answer anything. Yes.
So I have two questions. Well, kind of the same. So what are those targets for the cost of CO2 sequestration? Something like $40 a ton. Probably no better than I do. Right now, you probably know better than I do. Maybe coal costs $30 a ton with the utility. So those two together, and you get times the cost of burning coal. So that's the first question. How does that economics work out? Secondly, on the scaling, there was a ambitious goal of 2 million tons a day at some point in one of these projects, right in the future.
Not a day, but yeah, but collectively, probably you're talking about 2 million tons per day, multiple projects. Yeah.
That's one day. Why are we going less? So doesn't it make more sense to take all that money and buy up coal-fired plants and shut them down because they're the major contributors?
So I'm not sure if everybody heard you, so I'll just repeat the question. So the first one was about how the economics of CCS really work. And so, with a target of $40 per ton of stored CO2 versus $30 per ton of coal, basically,
This is more than 2 tons of CO2.
which produces more than 2 tons of CO2. You should be answering the question. And so, and then the second question was more about how does, refresh my memory now. So,
The promise, can you even scale this?
can you scale this up?
because it needs to be done now.
Yeah,
Right? We
yeah.
can't wait around the scale.
Yeah, so the typical thing that you will hear is that the cost is going to continue to come down for stored CO2. But right now it is economically viable because there is a tax credit called the 45Q tax credit, which increasingly, right now it's $50 per ton for CO2 stored in a saline reservoir, $35 a ton per ton for enhanced oil recovery. You can transfer who owns that tax credit. So you can, if you're an investment company and you don't have a tax liability, you can transfer to somebody somewhere down the chain. And so that right now is enough of a driver to have a lot of interest. Scott and I were talking about this. I probably get 20 calls a week about people who are looking at getting the 45Q tax credit and doing CO2 storage in the Illinois basin. There are changes coming to the tax credit. I think we will also continue to have to see additional federal policies, loan guarantee programs, things like that are going to happen. But it's like the wind and solar industry, 30 years ago, where there's been a lot of incentives, and that's the theory that's being worked on, is that that's how you get there. In terms of buying up all the coal plants and shutting them down, that's kind of happening. There's
Economics are already against them, and
Yeah.
now we're adding more costs.
Yeah, exactly. And there's an energy penalty too that needs to be brought down. So that's another factor of, you lose an additional 10 to 30% or need an additional 10 to 30% power to operate in terms of your carbon capture equipment. So all of those things, I don't have a great answer, but all of those things are factors that research and development and demonstration are designed to bring into sort of reasonable ranges so that it is commercially economically viable.
Questions, do we have time?
Well, yeah, it is a good question. Do we have time? But at the same time, we don't have time to stop and figure it out. We have to just do what we can. Scott.
So just to follow up on this, it's not just about coal. So, no, but I'm going to ask you the question.
Oh, you're going to ask me a question. I thought you were going to answer
So
the
it's
question.
carbon capture storage just isn't about coal. Decarbonization is across all fields. Getting to net zero is about all industries. Can you comment on other industries that are looking at carbon capture and storage and maybe future ones?
Yeah, so what Scott was saying is it's not just about coal and coal emissions from coal, but there are other sectors, and he wanted me to comment on what other industries are looking at carbon capture and storage. So our projects in Decatur are a great example. So the ethanol industry, the capturing of CO2 from biofuel production, is extremely interested and very what a lot of people would consider the low-hanging fruit. It's very easy to capture. It's very straightforward. You have the cement industry, which produces a lot of carbon dioxide. You have the ammonia development industry. As we move into the energy transition space and you start to talk about a hydrogen energy economy, then you're also looking at colored hydrogen, where if you hear the phrase blue hydrogen, that essentially means the production of hydrogen with carbon capture and storage, so that makes it net zero, or green hydrogen, where you've got the production of hydrogen from a non-fossil fuel source also combined with CO2 capture, so that again, you're at a net zero. So all of those things are areas that are, or all of those industries are areas where we're seeing a significant amount of development. I'm going to go to you.
So have you ever considered utilizing or developing empty coal beds or making this more purpose?
Yeah, so the question is, has anybody looked at using empty coal beds as
a storage mechanism. So there is a process called enhanced coal bed methane recovery, which does exactly that, which allows you to adsorb CO2 on coal beds and release any methane that is stored therein and then capture that to use as a natural gas source. It's been researched. It's not widely done at this point. It could be done. It has some challenges associated with the CO2 is only stored for as long as you don't mine the coal. And so if you were to go in and disrupt the coal, then you're disrupting the CO2 that's stored there. And it's at this point, it's expensive and sort of a challenge to do, but it can be done.
Yeah, I have a related question. Could you compare the pros and cons of injecting it into the, say, saline versus converting it into some kind of solid? Say carbon.
So the pros and cons of injecting stored CO2 into a saline reservoir versus making it into a solid. So I would say the major advantage to storing in a saline reservoir is the volume of CO2 that you can store instead of converting to some sort of physical material. If you're talking about from a geologic perspective or a geochemistry perspective, the kinetics of permanent storage of mineralization is actually quite slow. So that's kind of a con. And I think that we're in the early laboratory, the early technology level, readiness levels for utilization, and innovation is going to get us a lot further with respect to CO2 products, but we're not as far along in that process as we are with carbon storage.
So we talked about shutting down the coal plants and changes in everything. But I'm thinking about direct air capture, right? What is the state of direct air? I only know one company, Carbon Engineering, that is doing stuff like direct air capture. Because I think eventually we run out of coal power plants, probably run out of some other plants that emit lots of CO2. But we'll still have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere that we need to take out. Because even if we do CCUS now, we still have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere to take out. So what's the state of DAC?
So direct air capture is a technology, and this is in its most basic form, basically vacuum CO2 out of the atmosphere. It is a demonstrated technology that exists. We maybe heard recently that there's a direct air capture plant that's been built or being built in Iceland, which has the capacity to remove 4,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. So, and there's the rub. My project, the Decatur project, the Illinois-based Decatur project that I was just talking about, stored 3,000 tons per day. And so volumetrically, DAC is a long way from being a viable solution. The other thing is once you've removed that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, what are you going to do with it? So are you going to use it for something, or are you going to store it? And this is one of the challenges when a lot of people will divorce the capture side from sort of the upstream from the downstream side of things, where if you don't think about them holistically, carbon capture is not enough. So direct air capture, all that being said, direct air capture has a place and it's important. And I can envision a scenario where you have direct air capture plants that are co-located with storage projects, or where you need certain amounts of CO2 for different processes or something, where it's a commodity that you need. But whether or not direct air capture is going to resolve our capture and storage challenges at the magnitude that we need them to do now, and, you know, to your point, is we're a long way from that. But things will, you know, innovation and is a great indicator. Yeah.
So what's the plan for, what can you do with the CO2 after the storage period is over? You mentioned the 30 period, and 10 period, year period. Do we not know yet what we're gonna do with all that CO2 that's being stored? And how many of these wells or whatever these holding reservoirs can we have if we run out?
Okay, so the question is, what's going to happen with the stored CO2 after 10 years, 30 years, after you've been injecting? And is there a limit to the number of places or wells that you can store CO2 out of? So what happens with the carbon dioxide in one of these large projects where you're injecting millions of tons over a period of 10 or 30 years is that carbon dioxide is permanently, I'm gonna turn this on, permanently stored in the subsurface. So we're not, the idea is that it is captured before it goes into the atmosphere. And so it is not a part of the equation of what we need to remove because we've prevented it from going into the atmosphere and we have permanently stored it in the subsurface. So we're not looking to extract that carbon dioxide back out for some sort of use purpose. We're trying to engineer a system with using the earth as an ally to keep that carbon dioxide stored for millennia. So, and with respect to, will we run out of areas or places where we can do this? There is a capacity that is finite, but at this point in time, we have a lot of sedimentary rock in a lot of places around the world where we can do carbon capture and storage. In the Illinois Basin, we have on the order of somewhere between 4 and 40 gigatons worth of storage capacity, which is, 100 years worth of CO2 storage potential over the long haul. So is it possible to run out? Absolutely. Is it possible to face challenges along the way? Absolutely. Is there any indication that we won't have enough storage capacity in the near future? Absolutely not. Hopefully that answers your question.
All right, let's close the session. Great discussion. Thank you, everybody. And please join me in thanking Sallie.